elderly woman bullied by bikers at a diner, but her next move shocks everyone. The diner, once filled with the peaceful sounds of everyday life, fell into a tense silence as the group of bikers made their presence known. The clinking of forks stopped, conversations halted, and eyes nervously darted toward the back corner where Grace sat, a fragile figure amidst the rising storm. The leader's booming voice cut through the air like a knife, demanding everyone's attention. Grace, however, remained still, her frail hands steadying the mug of tea, her gaze focused on the steam curling from the surface. She seemed completely unfazed, as though the intrusion of the bikers was no more significant than a breeze through an open window. The leader's sneer grew darker as he leaned closer, his hot breath smelling of stale beer and cigarettes. "You think you're better than us, huh?" he growled, his voice dripping with menace. The gang circled her table now, like predators eyeing their prey. Each man carried an air of arrogance, their rough laughter and jarring jeers filling the small space. A few patrons tried to discreetly slip out of the diner, sensing the danger escalating. The waitress, her hands shaking, backed away from the counter, her eyes darting between the bikers and Grace, as if unsure whether to intervene or hide. The leader slammed his fist onto the table once more, harder this time, knocking over her tea. "I said, move, you old bag," he shouted, his voice echoing through the diner. For the first time, Grace stirred. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her gaze from the spilled tea, her eyes meeting the leader's with a calmness that unsettled him. She spoke softly, her voice barely above a whisper, but strong enough to slice through the tension in the room. "You should learn some manners," she said, her tone measured, almost scolding, as if speaking to a misbehaving child rather than a towering biker. A ripple of surprise passed through the gang. The leader's face flushed red with anger, his hands balled into fists. "What did you just say?" he snarled, leaning even closer, at the same time noticing the logo on Sam's jacket. "You're..." Grace didn't flinch. She set her mug down carefully, her movements deliberate. "You heard me," she replied. "Now leave, before you regret it." The laughter that erupted from the group was instant and mocking. "Regret it?" the leader scoffed, his hands slamming the table again. "Who do you think you are, old lady? You think you can scare us?" But behind Grace's eyes was something none of them expected. Beneath her quiet demeanor was a history, a strength forged in times of hardship they couldn't begin to imagine. The entire diner watched, breath held, as she slowly stood up, her frail figure contrasting sharply with the towering biker in front of her. She took a step forward, her gaze never leaving the leader's eyes. "I've dealt with men like you before," Grace said, her voice low but carrying the weight of experience. "Men who think they can intimidate and bully those weaker than them. But they all learned a lesson." The leader hesitated, just for a moment, his bravado cracking as something in her voice gave him pause. But his pride wouldn't let him back down in front of his gang. He reached out, grabbing her by the arm, intending to drag her out of the seat. In an instant, faster than anyone could have expected, Grace's hand shot out, twisting his wrist with a precision and force that made the leader yelp in pain. The gang froze, stunned, as they watched their leader buckle, his face contorting in agony. Grace released him just as quickly, and the leader stumbled back, clutching his wrist, disbelief in his eyes. The rest of the bikers exchanged shocked glances, unsure of what to do next. The whole diner was dead silent, eyes wide, as if the scene unfolding before them was from a movie, not real life. "You should leave now," Grace said calmly, her voice steady, "before you embarrass yourself any further." The leader, still wincing from the pain in his wrist, looked up at her with a mixture of fury and fear, but deep down he knew he had lost. Muttering curses under his breath, he motioned for his gang to follow him. One by one, they filed out of the diner, their cocky demeanor shattered. As the door closed behind them, the tension in the diner broke like a wave, and the patrons slowly returned to their meals, murmuring in disbelief. The waitress rushed over, her eyes wide with amazement. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. Grace smiled, the soft grandmotherly expression returning to her face as if nothing had happened. She reached for a napkin and began cleaning the spilled tea. "I'm fine, dear," she said gently. "Sometimes people just need a reminder of their manners." Grace stroked Mim, and with that she sat back down, as if the entire confrontation had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The quiet hum of the diner resumed, but no one would forget what they had just witnessed. Hidden beneath Grace's gentle appearance was a strength no one had anticipated, a strength that had, for one night at least, brought a group of bikers to their knees. Grace's hand clenched the badge firmly, the metal gleaming under the dim lights of the diner. It wasn't just any badge. It was worn, the edges slightly frayed, a sign of countless years of service. Her eyes, once soft and grandmotherly, now held a hardened edge, revealing a past that none of the bikers, or even the regular patrons, could have ever imagined. The leader's grin faltered as the laughter from his gang died out. His arrogance wavered for the first time. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, disbelief coloring his words. His eyes darted to the badge and then back to Grace's face, as if trying to make sense of the scene unfolding before him. "You should choose your next words carefully," Grace said, her voice calm but now laced with authority, "because the last man who tried to intimidate me is still serving time." The leader blinked, his bravado visibly crumbling. His gang shifted uneasily behind him, the reality of the situation beginning to sink in. The tension in the diner was palpable, thick like a storm about to break. Patrons, once too afraid to look up, now stared openly, some of them recognizing the significance of Grace's badge. She wasn't just some retired officer. No, this was something much bigger. For the first time, the leader found himself at a loss for words. His confidence evaporated, leaving behind only nervous bravado. You think flashing that thing is going to scare me?" he stammered, though even he didn't believe his own words. Grace didn't flinch. "I've been dealing with men like you my whole life," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "The tattoos, the attitude, it doesn't scare me. I've seen it all before. You think you're tough, but you don't even know what real tough is." She took a step closer, and for the first time the leader stepped back. His gang exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to stand their ground or follow their leader's retreat. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the diner's neon lights, the calm before the storm. "You want to know who I am?" Grace asked, her voice low and dangerous. "I'm Grace Reynolds, former detective. 30 years on the force, most of them in a precinct you wouldn't survive a day in. I've taken down men 10 times tougher than you and your little gang here. You want to test me? Go ahead." The leader's bravado was now completely gone. His eyes darted around the room, looking for a way out. His gang, once so confident and mocking, stood awkwardly, none of them daring to make a move. Grace stood tall, her badge still glinting in her hand, her expression unwavering. "Here's what's going to happen," she said, her voice steady and commanding. "You and your crew are going to walk out of this diner. You're going to get on your bikes and you're going to ride out of town. Because if you don't, I'll make one phone call and you won't even make it out of the parking lot before you're all in cuffs." The leader swallowed hard, his face pale. For a brief moment he considered making one last stand, but the look in Grace's eyes told him it would be a mistake. She wasn't bluffing. He could see it in her stance, in the quiet confidence she exuded. She wasn't scared of him, not in the slightest. He turned to his gang, his voice barely a whisper now. "Let's get out of here," he muttered, defeated. One by one, the bikers followed their leader's retreat, shuffling out of the diner in stunned silence. As the door closed behind them, the tension in the room finally broke. The patrons, who had been holding their breath, exhaled in collective relief. The waitress, her hands still shaking, approached Grace slowly, her voice full of awe. Are you really a cop?" Grace smiled softly, her demeanor returning to the gentle woman she had appeared to be at the start. She slipped the badge back into her purse with a small nod. "Retired," she said quietly, "but some habits die hard." The waitress chuckled nervously. "I think you just saved all of us." Grace's eyes softened, and she patted the waitress's hand gently. "No need to thank me, dear. Sometimes people just need a little reminder of the law." She sat back down, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened, picking up a new mug of tea that the waitress had brought her. As the quiet hum of the diner slowly resumed, the patrons exchanged glances, all of them sharing the same thought. Grace Reynolds was far more than meets the eye. In that small, unassuming diner, an elderly woman had stood down a gang of bikers without breaking a sweat. It was a story they'd tell for years, a story of an unexpected hero who, even in retirement, still knew exactly how to serve and protect. Grace's words hung in the air like a heavy storm cloud, her presence commanding the entire room. She didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. Her tone alone carried enough authority to silence even the rowdiest crowd. The biker leader, who had once towered over her with unchecked arrogance, now stood reduced to a shell of the man he'd tried to be. His eyes darted nervously between Grace and his gang, searching for some semblance of support. But even his comrades were frozen, unsure of how to react. The weight of the situation crashed down on them all. An elderly woman, a retired police chief, was now the most dangerous person in the room. The very person they had underestimated was dismantling their tough guy facade with a few well-placed words and a lifetime of experience they couldn't comprehend. "I don't think you understand who you're dealing with," Grace said, her voice calm but laced with an undeniable force. "This isn't a game. I've faced men far worse than you, and every one of them walked away with regrets. So, I'll say it one last time. Apologize properly, or I'll make sure your fun ends in a cell tonight." The leader swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. His face, once twisted in a sneer of confidence, was now flushed with shame and fear. His gang shifted awkwardly behind him, some of them exchanging nervous glances, but none dared to step forward. The silence that followed was suffocating. Every patron in the diner held their breath, waiting for the next move. The tension was so thick that even the hum of the overhead lights seemed too loud. No one dared to speak. No one dared to even whisper. The entire room had been caught in Grace's invisible grip, each of them wondering if the bikers were foolish enough to test her further. But the leader wasn't completely stupid. He knew he had already lost. His hands shook as he fumbled for words, his pride barely holding on by a thread. "We didn't mean nothing," he mumbled, his voice cracking under the pressure. "We were just messing around, that's all." Grace didn't move, her eyes sharp and unrelenting. "That's not an apology," she said softly, though her voice carried more weight than if she had yelled. "Apologize to everyone." The leader's face turned pale as he glanced around the diner, meeting the wary eyes of the patrons he had intimidated just moments before. His shoulders sagged under the weight of his humiliation, and with a trembling voice he finally spoke. "Sorry," he muttered, barely loud enough for anyone to hear. Grace raised an eyebrow, her piercing gaze boring into him. "Louder!" she demanded. The leader winced, as if the command itself hurt. He cleared his throat, his voice shaking as he repeated himself, this time loud enough for the entire diner to hear. "I'm sorry. We didn't mean to cause trouble." Behind him, his gang stood rigid, their tough exteriors cracking under the pressure of the moment. One by one, they echoed their leader's apology, their voices low and embarrassed. The humiliation was palpable. hanging over them like a dark cloud as they realized how drastically the situation had turned. Grace didn't move, didn't even blink, until each one of them had spoken. Only then did she step back, giving them room to leave. "Now get out," she said quietly, her voice still carrying that same iron authority. "And remember what I said. If I see you around here again, you'll be in cuffs faster than you can blink." Without another word, the bikers hurried for the exit, their swagger completely gone. The leader kept his head down, refusing to meet Grace's gaze as he pushed through the door, his gang following close behind. They didn't look back as they fled into the night, their motorcycles roaring to life in the parking lot. The sound of their engines faded into the distance, leaving behind a stunned silence in the diner. As the door closed behind them, the tension in the room finally eased. The patrons, who had been holding their breath in anticipation, slowly returned to their seats, exchanging looks of disbelief. Whispers began to spread, people murmuring about what they had just witnessed. Some of them smiled in relief, others shook their heads in awe. It wasn't every day that an elderly woman stood up to a gang of bikers and sent them running. The waitress, who had been frozen in shock, finally approached Grace, her voice shaky with gratitude. "Thank you," she stammered. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Grace smiled softly, her face once again warm and kind, the hard edge of her former self receding. "It's all right, dear," she said gently. "Sometimes people just need to be reminded of their place." As she sat down, the waitress hurried to bring her a fresh cup of tea, her hands still trembling from the adrenaline. The other patrons nodded their thanks to Grace, some offering quiet words of appreciation, others simply giving her a respectful nod. But Grace wasn't looking for recognition. She had seen enough of the world to know that her actions weren't about glory, they were about doing what was right. And tonight, in a small diner surrounded by strangers, she had shown that courage and justice had no age limit. The bikers may have left, but the weight of what had just transpired hung in the air like a fog. The diner, which had moments earlier been thick with tension and fear, now buzzed with an almost disbelieving energy. Soft clapping started from one table, then another, until it spread throughout the room. Patrons exchanged wide-eyed looks, their whispers filling the space as if trying to make sense of what they'd witnessed. A group of rowdy bikers had been utterly dismantled, not by fists or brute strength, but by an elderly woman whose presence alone had done what no one else had dared. The diner owner, a burly man in his late 50s with a grease-stained apron, hurried over to Grace, his face a mixture of awe and gratitude. His hands still trembled slightly as he approached her, almost as if he couldn't believe the events that had just unfolded. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I've seen a lot in this place, but what you did, that was something else. You didn't have to pay for your meal tonight. Heck, you'll never have to pay here again." Grace, ever calm and composed, smiled softly at the man. There was no trace of the steel that had been in her voice just moments ago, only a warmth that made her seem once again like the gentle grandmother everyone had first assumed her to be. "That's very kind of you," she said, her voice as steady as it had been throughout the entire ordeal. "But I've been keeping the peace my whole life. It's nothing new for me." She waved off his offer with a gentle hand, her demeanor as humble as ever. The owner, still shaking his head in disbelief, chuckled nervously. "Well, if you ever need anything, you just come by. This diner owes you big time." Grace nodded, her smile never wavering as she gathered her belongings. The whispers followed her as she made her way toward the door. She could feel the eyes of the other patrons on her, each of them trying to process how this small, frail-looking woman had stood toe-to-toe with a gang of bikers and won without raising a finger. It was as if they were watching a living legend walk out of their midst, someone who belonged in the pages of a book or on the big screen, not in their humble diner. As she pushed open the door, a gust of cool night air greeted her, the hum of the city just beyond the diner's walls. She paused for a moment, looking out at the empty street before her. It was quiet now, the roar of the bikers' engines long gone. For Grace, this was just another night, another small victory in a life filled with countless battles. No one in the diner could have known the depth of what Grace had been through in her years as a police chief. They couldn't have imagined the dangerous criminals she had faced, the life-threatening situations she had navigated with the same calm resolve. To them, she was an extraordinary woman who had just done something unforgettable. But for Grace, this was simply a continuation of a life spent standing up to those who thought they could bully or intimidate the innocent. She had seen men far more dangerous than that gang of bikers. She had stared down people who had nothing to lose, people who would have pulled a weapon without a second thought. And yet, here she was, still standing, still unshaken. Tonight was just another reminder that no matter how old she grew, the fire inside her to protect and uphold justice would never fade. Beaming into the night, the lights of the diner glowing faintly behind her, she knew that her work was never truly done. There would always be someone who needed help, always someone who underestimated her because of her age or her appearance. And that was fine by her. She didn't need recognition or applause. The knowledge that she had made a difference, no matter how small, was all the reward she needed. Back inside the diner, the patrons slowly resumed their meals, but the conversation didn't stop. They would talk about this night for years to come. How the elderly woman with the tea had stood up to a gang of bikers and sent them packing. It would become a local legend, the kind of story people shared with wide eyes and hushed voices. And though Grace would never be around to hear it, one thing was certain: the night the elderly woman shocked everyone at the diner would never be forgotten.